Marrowbridge kept its secrets in the folds of fog that rose off the river like breath. At dawn, the town looked as if it were holding its own remembrance, shutters half closed, cobbles still damp, gutters sighing with the night's refuse. The market opened like a deliberate wound. Stalls of citrus and cinnamon, bolts of linen, the brown sugar sheen of warm pastries. On the high street, the mansions wore their light like armor. Whitewashed facades, iron balconies, curtains that never stirred for servants. Downstairs, where the alleys inhaled the deepest shadows, life moved in different rhythms. Here, worth was weighed not by the hands that worked, but by the hue of skin and the roundness of coin. Naya moved those alleys like a note someone hummed when they thought no one was listening. She did sparrow runs in the early hours, bread to the dairy women, ointments to the herbalist whose fingers trembled with age, letters to places none of the carriage folk would go. Her basket was an extension of her, dented tin, strap worn smooth, the sack patched in 3 places. She tucked her hair under a scarf and tied the world in place with a knot they called modesty. The town called her other things in their private voices, dark as the river mud, too round for her own good, a shadow that thinks itself a woman. The names clung to her like lint. She had learned to walk as if they were only breath. People looked past Naya the way the market breeze looked past the old lamps, a polite omission that left her visible but unvalued. She carried packages heavier than compliments. She accepted coins with a small, brief smile that never asked for more than the exchange required. When children laughed at her, it was the sound adults taught them to make, a trimming, an acceptance of the easy cruelty that kept the town's hierarchy tidy. Once, a wealthy woman lifted her chin to study Naya as if she were a fabric sample. "You should try to be lighter," she said softly enough that the whole stall heard, and the world rearranged itself to account for the instruction. Naya's hands, though, were instruments of other knowledge. They knew the map of the town the way some people know maps of their own childhoods. Where a roof leaked in a certain storm, which midwife kept tea warm for the nurse who never slept, the exact window from which a boy watched the river and wished he could be someone else. She set down loaves and ointments, and sometimes a bowl for a child who had no mother to notice the hunger. She would stand a moment after a delivery and listen to the small noises inside a house. A cough, the rustle of a blanket, the soft syllable of a name, and memorize them like prayers. There was always the ache of being unseen in those memorized prayers, a private ledger of compassion that nobody added to aloud. Rumors were part of Marrowbridge's currency, and one passed through the alleys with the weight of old iron. The vampire king's son was dying. It was the sort of story that belonged to the nights, the taverns, the half-lit corners where poets burned paper. In the market, it sounded like myth retold to keep the cold from settling into one's bones, a cautionary tale adults used to explain loneliness or excess. But stories have a way of moving into the daylight if you let them, and that particular whisper picked at something behind Naya's ribs. She had always considered vampires a kind of moral geometry, angles of danger, distances to be kept. They were the grander town's private aristocracy, pale, polished, aristocratic as frost. The king was a silhouette on banners in the upper square, a portrait in midnight and enamel, the name spoken in a voice that lowered itself with respect. To Naya, they were as distant as the moon until the day a delivery manifest arrived at Sparrow Runs with no name but a royal seal. A wreath of thorns stamped in red wax, an emblem she recognized only because the ringer at the highest doors kept the same image on a silver key. She held the parcel in her lap at dusk, wrapped in a linen cloth that smelled faintly of rosemary and river bleach, and for a moment the alley's air seemed to flatten. Her fingers hesitated. Many things had entered her life without asking. Insults, the weight of expectations, the shrug of townsfolk who had been taught who deserved care. But there was a curiosity that had nothing to do with the arrogance of the curious. It was quieter, like a child stepping toward the edge of a pond to see whether ripples answered. If they are true, she thought, then the dying child must be a child in some way. The work of Sparrow Runs was not to refuse any address, and so she tucked the linen into her basket and set off. The route was written in the margin of the manifest, the manor on Blackrise Hill. Her boots carried her up slopes where wind scoured at the skin of the town, and houses closed their faces, as if insulted by the very idea of foot traffic. Atop the hill, the mansion brooded like stone that had been thinking too long. Lanterns threw lances of light, and a gate with spiked teeth kept secrets that smelled of old blood and older laws. A servant in livery came to meet her, face like a washed plate, eyes like coins. He looked at her as if he were studying a stain. "We do not expect deliveries from Sparrow Runs," he said, voice precise as a knife. Behind him, shadows shifted. There were no other couriers at that hour, only the hush of caretakers who had been told to wait. "This is private," the man added, though the manifest was in his hand. Naya lifted the linen without permission. There was a steadiness to her that never needed to shout for consideration. "It's for a child who's unwell," she said. She said it not because she believed herself to be an emissary of goodwill. She often delivered to the unwell as a matter of business, but because the sound of the words softened the line between for them and for all of us. He held the sealed parcel, turned it as if the wax were a relic. His finger brushed the sigil, and for a heartbeat long enough that she felt it like a small current, his eyes flicked to hers with something that was not merely appraisal. There was the faintest clench at the edge of his lip, the way a man catches a coin he didn't expect to lose. The servant raised the gate, and the iron sang like a bell cut wrong. As she stepped across the threshold, Naya had the strange, private sense of being examined by an entire house. The walls consumed sound. Portraits watched with the slyness of captive animals. It was as if the very architecture practiced discretion. Yet on a small slip of parchment wrapped to the parcel, in a clerk's neat hand, one word waited. Naya, her name, addressed to her as if someone inside the dark had known precisely whose hands would carry the linen, and had waited. She traced the looping ink with the tip of her thumb. The royal seal, red wax, stamped with a ring of thorns, still glimmered at the fold, as if the memory of some old bite refused to smooth away. It was a summons written in a script that did not ask for permission. The alley behind her hummed with a dozen small injustices she could name, and the mansion lit its windows with all the patience of a world that had seen too many winters. She stepped forward anyway. There is a particular moment before the door shuts behind you when the air tastes of everything you left. Naya tasted the market's citrus, the baker's yeast, the soft fire of people who have loved and been refused love back. She did not know whether she was moving toward ruin or toward a strange kind of mercy. She only knew that the parcel in her basket was addressed to her by a hand that did not move without intention, and that sometimes the quietest hands were the only ones that could undo a long, fat chain. When the servant slid the iron gate closed, the wax on the parcel gleamed like a promise or like a warning. Naya could not yet tell which. The road up Blackrise Hill was a mouth of stone that ate the town's light. By the time Naya climbed it, the market's warmth was a rumor behind her. The moon sat high and cold, an indifferent coin. Wind pulled at her scarf, and the linen in her basket smelled of rosemary and something older, iron and cedar, a scent that seemed to belong to rooms that had been shut for years. The gate that the servant had opened earlier closed with a finality that sounded like a verdict. The mansion rose from the hill like an accusation. It was not merely large. It was designed to be looked at from a distance, to be admired like a thing in a museum, never touched. Gargoyles watched over balustrades. Long windows reflected the moon like slow, lidless eyes. There was no laughter, no stray light. Even the ivy seemed to be keeping penitence. Inside, the house breathed in slow, careful inhalations. Servants moved through halls with a choreography so practiced it felt like ritual, the footfalls of those who had been taught their place. Their faces were pale and impeccable, and their eyes, when they looked at Naya, were like coins struck from some strange alloy, too clear and too cold. She would later tell herself she had thought them painted. At the time, she only felt their gaze as a small, slicing wind. They led her down corridors where portraits watched with the composure of long-suffering witnesses. Each painting was a lesson in pedigree. Stern jaws, high noses, the slightly purple lips of people who had never had to plead for bread. A choir of muted whispers followed her like a train. Latin that smelled of incense, the scratch of quill over paper, the soft, exacting clicks of scholars who document death as if to tame it. The chamber where Lucien lay, was a room that seemed to be built to prevent sound. Tapestries hung like blankets against the walls, swallowing steps. Candles burned but gave no warmth. Their flame behaved like secrets in a mouth. A circle of men and women stood around a bed whose sheets were more linen than comfort. Scholars in ink-stained collars bent over notebooks. Priests in robes pressed prayer beads and murmured as if the right number could tip a scale. Doctors, white-cloaked, tired-eyed, pinched their brows and talked in a language of prognosis and impossibility. Lucien lay at the center like a pale statue, as if memory had sculpted a son out of the king's best regrets. He was thinner than portraits suggested, fragile as old parchment. The skin at his throat was almost translucent under the lamp's weak light. His lashes lay flat as if sleep had been ordered. Tubes and vials clustered like an altar. A small crown, not of gold, but of some dark metal, rested upon the bedside table, untouched. When Naya stepped forward with the basket, the room made a sound that was part intake, part disapproval. Eyes flicked up with the same precision of someone who had been taught to blink at the right moment. The head scholar's mouth pursed. One of the priests made a slight sign. It was a language of "this is not for you," said through the careful channels of those who never raised their voices. She remembered the manifest's looped Naya and the wax stamp. She remembered the market's smell and the baker's laugh. She remembered why the job asked her to go where others would not. Her hands, so used to the gestures of trade, fold, tie, pass, held out the basket, and she said, not to the scholars but to the room itself, "Herbal tonics. For calming the fever." No one answered. A doctor made a dry sound. A priest's eyes flicked to his beads. But Lucien, who had been there in the room in a way that was less present than the instruments around him, moved slightly, like a moth caught somewhere between dream and motion. She had come to deliver medicine. The world had not expected her to make noise in a chamber of silence. The scholars returned to their instruments. One of the doctors turned the basket as if examining a specimen. His fingers were scholarly and thin. "We have tried everything," he said, as if he were reading from a ledger he wished were shorter. "Potions, bloodwork rites, the underlying issue is not physiological." Naya glanced at the bed. Lucien's chest was a shallow map. He looked as if the moon had taken up residence inside him. For a moment, she could only see a face that had been made for marble. Cheekbones like delicate architecture, lips the color of the cold. He looked very much like the portrait that hung in the town hall, and very much unlike any child she had ever known. She should have retreated when they signaled she should. Her business was deliveries, not interventions. The house expected her to step back into the place where the lower orders are taught to belong. But there is a certain hunger in people who have always been told to be small. A curiosity that isn't proud, only honest. Naya's voice, low and plain, rose across the circle. "Why do you treat him like a body?" she said. "When he is a person." It was not accusation so much as a question that had been living behind her ribs for a long time, waiting for someone to give it breath. The air in the room tasted suddenly of old prayers and new shock. Silence answered. Heads turned with the slow, stony cooperation of those unused to being asked to feel. The head scholar's face arranged itself into the proper shape of concern. "Madam," he began, his tone the measured one of those who taught consolation as a duty, "this is not ordinary." Naya stepped closer, as if proximity could reorder the universe. Up close she could see the fine lines at the corners of Lucien's eyes, the faint bruise of a vein like a road under skin. Her fingers, practical, warm, hovered, and then did the simple, audacious thing that had come to her naturally across years of patching wounds in merchant stalls and pressing cloths to fevered brows. She reached for his hand. It was colder than the river in January. The room took in a breath as if the world had shifted its weight. The servants made the smallest of noises, a catching of breath disguised as a shuffle. A priest's beads slid through fingers with the sound of a rosary dropped. From somewhere high in the hall, a sound settled, not a man's voice, but a presence. The king stood at the doorway like a shadow cast in black velvet. He had the grandeur of portrait and the hush of trampling fog. His crown trembled in a way that suggested age and certainty, not weakness. He watched Naya with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite curiosity, somewhere on a long axis that measured disturbances to his order. "You have no place here," the king said, and the room's air leaned with the weight of that statement. It was a sentence designed to fold someone back into neatness. Naya did not retreat. Her hand rested on Lucien's palm like a small, warm argument. "He is not an experiment," she said. "He is someone whose breath is being counted like a debt." The king's profile did not move, but something in the way the servant stiffened told her she had crossed a line. The head scholar opened his mouth as if to call for security. The room smelled, faintly, of the wax that sealed the parcel, the same color as the king's private sigil. Before they could decide what to do with her, Lucien's eyelids trembled. It was the smallest motion, a flutter like a flag in a distant wind, but in the hush it sounded like a bell. For days he had not opened them. For days the scholars had argued that perhaps the soul was no longer willing to anchor itself to the body. Now, under the careless, human warmth of a delivery girl's hand, his lashes lifted and his eyes, gray, the palest glass, looked directly at her. There was no pomp in the glance. It was not recognition so much as astonishment, and in it there was an unpracticed tenderness that stunned the room. Naya felt, in that thin thread of a look, the sense of being seen as one is, not as one is supposed to be. The king's jaw tightened. The scholars murmured behind hands. A coldness moved through the house as if a winter wind had found a seam. When the attendants finally steered her away, it felt less like banishment and more like extraction. "You must leave," the head scholar said quietly, but Lucien's gaze followed her as if it could catch on her shoulder and refuse to let go. In the corridor, as a servant closed the door behind her with the soft finality of falling pinions, Naya knew that the night had tilted. The parcel in her basket had been addressed to her name, and now something else, something larger than the manifest, had answered back. There are moments in a life that feel like a slow turning of a key in a door. You can hear the metal scrape and know the mechanism is changing, even if the room beyond remains mostly dark. For Naya, being summoned back to Blackrise Hill by royal decree was such a turning. The decree arrived on pale paper edged in black, the same waxed sigil sealing its flap. It was delivered not by the market boy, but by a footman whose face had been pressed into the geometry of obedience. The messenger bowed, and at the fold of his elbow the paper trembled like someone keeping a secret. "You will go with the maid to the West Wing," the footman said, as if reciting a map of roles. "You are required at dusk." The words had a ring of inevitability. They fit into the world like an addition problem the town expected to solve without complaint. Naya read the signature, a rigid hand, the king's mark, and felt something like the stir of a bell inside her chest. She folded the decree into her apron and continued sparrow runs, because humility had taught her to keep moving even when the ground shifted. When the summons came a second time, a whispered name from a servant who had soft eyes for more than just the family line, Naya went. The mansion received her with the same chill and the same choreography of servants whose palms were practiced for the absence of warmth. This time, the corridor to the West Wing smelled faintly of crushed jasmine and old ink. They led her to a small chamber that had been prepared with the exacting care of someone who still believed in dignity, even when forgetting how to practice it. "Madam Naya," the head scholar said, voice softened as if smoothing a page, "you have been asked to return because the boy's condition has worsened." He used boy as if the syllable might make illness smaller. "Doctors have tried every remedy in our libraries. They have bled him, warmed him, starved him, bathed him in rites written before the flood. The curse deepens each moon. We are at an impasse." "Curse?" Naya asked, because she had not yet learned the town's eloquent ways of avoiding compassion. The word arrived like a cold stone. "What kind of curse takes a breath from a child?" The doctor's hands trembled when he made the sign a scholar teaches for the dreadful. "The hollow heart," he said. "A wound in a soul's core. We keep him alive for the sake of the line, but—" He stopped, and there was a fold in the sentence where guilt and protocol met. "We cannot heal what is not of us." She listened to learned people measure the impossibility with instruments, with charts, with the sterile satin of words. Their language tried to put distance between suffering and feeling. There was a tenderness in their professional pity that read more like a ledger than a touch. That night, Naya sat by Lucien's bed, and felt that barrier as plainly as the cold stone under the mansion foundations. Lucien lay thinner than the portraits had promised, but there was a light to him that had nothing to do with health charts. It looked like memory, the ghost of laughter, the echo of some childhood only he had known. Naya had no training in the esoteric disciplines gathered in the mansion's shelves, but she had a rough, daily education in human needs. She knew how to fold a bandage, how to hold a bowl when a fever made a body betray itself, how to murmur a name in the dark so the lonely would not believe the quiet had swallowed them whole. She sat and she listened to the sound of a breathing that wanted to be more. "Why do you keep me here?" Lucien's voice, when it came, was smaller than she expected. Not the aristocratic baritone rumor had given him, but there was an echo of something old and tired. His tongue moved as if surprised to be asked to shape words. "Do you think I am safer in silence?" Naya's hand found the seam of his blanket with a natural gesture. "People need other people when they are cold," she replied, "even if it's only to keep the cold honest." That was not a line the scholars would have printed in their books. It was not a remedy. It was, however, a thing a soul recognizes. Lucien's lashes trembled. The pallor in his throat seemed, for a moment, to be relieved. The doctors watched from the doorway with a precise neutrality that tried to pass for interest. Naya felt, as she often did, the way her small axe gathered the shape of something larger than herself. It was an unrefined magic, attention. Days and nights blurred into a pattern. The scholars with their charts, the priests with their prayers, the doctors with their tired hands, all moving like a clock that had forgotten how to be warm. Naya made each visit as if the world might forget how to be kind by accident. She brought tea steeped heavier than propriety allowed. She set cool compresses when his brow flamed like a sudden sun. She smoothed his sheets the way someone would smooth a map. Her touch was not ritualized. It was pragmatic, human. Her fingers smelled of rosemary and bread and the river mud she had once wrestled as a child. The strange thing, and it was the kind of strange that unravels the very idea of what the attentive heart can accomplish, was that when Naya's skin pressed against his, light moved in Lucien. It began as the smallest glint, a shimmer under the thin white of his veins, like morning stealing through curtains. The scholars noticed first. The scribbles on a page paused mid-sentence, the priest's palms stilled around beads. One morning, a doctor who prided himself on the exactitude of his instruments found a line of faint, luminous thread coursing beneath Lucien's skin where Naya had placed a cool palm. "Bioluminescence," the scholar proposed, because science is a refuge in the uncomfortable. But the glow was not mechanical. It flared and settled in time with Naya's voice when she read nonsense rhymes to the prince to make him laugh. It shimmered when she braided a ribbon into his hair, absurd, tender gestures that had nothing to do with the meticulous remedies the mansion preferred. The house hummed with whispers. Servants passed looks the way townspeople pass gossip. In private, when moonlight carved the world into silver edges, Lucien spoke to Naya as if to someone who had been given a key. "You smell like rain before it falls," he murmured one night, the first sentence shaped fully and intended for her alone. The line was not coquettish. It was astonishment translated into poetry. In the hush that followed, the mansion seemed to hold its breath. Naya's heart, which had rehearsed the grammar of small mercies for years, gave a small, unexpected answer. She smiled. "You smell like the market after a storm," she said, because that was a detail she loved and believed in. "And sometimes like warm bread, and sometimes like you." Saying it felt like giving him back a sound. They learned to inhabit quieter things together. Sunlight in a corner, the way his fingers reacted to the press of her hand, the small laugh that escaped him when she told a story badly and made the rhymes implode. Romance in Blackrise Hill did not begin with a ball or a grand confession. It began with the easing of a breath, the unwrapping of a person who had been carefully preserved into a museum piece. Lucien's awakening was not merely physical. It was an unshuttering of something that wanted to be whole. News, as it always does, had no interest in the whole nuance of a private moment. It preferred a soundbite, a rumor with teeth. Rumor runs faster than a courier. By the time Naya returned to Marrowbridge, the river had become a messenger of a different sort, stone throwers and whispers. Children pointed at her skirt with the relish of learned cruelty. Old women folded their lips in the market and shook their heads like dried leaves. "The girl bewitched the prince," someone said. "She comes from the mud," another offered, as if the mud were a sin. Sparrow Runs, which had never been immune to gossip, found itself the locus of suspicion. Letters that used to be paid for in coin now required stares and polite condescension. A group of boys who used to chase her with dares now threw a slate at her cart when she passed the schoolhouse. A girl who used to share bread with her under the lemon tree now would not meet her gaze. The town was testing the malleability of its prejudices and finding them, as always, painfully easy to reform. "Are you ashamed?" one of the maidens asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and a taste for scandal. "To be seen with him. He is of the king." "I am not ashamed to be kind," Naya answered simply. "Kindness doesn't carry a lineage." Her answer only sharpened certain people's hunger for order. Children, who learn cruelty as easily as lessons, began to whisper that Naya was a witch. Little hands repeated the word as if it were a toy learned and then abandoned. The label clung like burrs. Mothers tutted. Fathers frowned. The market murmured that if a lowborn girl's touch could awaken a prince, what else might she claim? The fear was not only of magic, it was fear of inversion. The possibility that a person the town had trained to be small might, by a twist of fate, gain power. Within the mansion, the reaction was different but no less precise. The vampire world Lucien belonged to operated on a currency older than gossip: blood, purity, lineage. The House of Thorns, as the king's line was known in dark speech, kept its traditions like the thin glass of an heirloom. Cracks were to be feared. Lucien's revival by a human hand threatened not only the illusion of control, but also the doctrine that separated their kind from the human tide. In whispered gatherings beneath the mansion's vaulted ceilings, nobles spoke of contamination and dilution, strange words that smelled of genealogies and the fear of losing ascendancy. "There are rules," said an elder of the blood, his voice a rasp like dry leaves. "We do not let human flame tread our halls. To allow it is to invite change." Change in their mouths was a word with teeth. It meant the end of privileges carved by centuries. The claim to twilight that made certain faces noble and others common. Naya's existence, so ordinary a thing in principle, loomed monstrous because it broke a tidy symmetry. It suggested that worth need not be bound to blood, and that a hand calloused in the market could make a king's son breathe. Not all of Lucien's kin were cruel. Some watched with a strange, quiet curiosity, others with thin smiles that hid calculation. But the hierarchy flexed, and the flexing made people dangerous. Councils met under low light. The king's shadow grew longer as he stood before maps and genealogies and counted losses that were not only of life, but of doctrine. "We must protect the line," he said more than once, and each time his voice wrapped itself in the same exacting gravity that had kept the mansion a repository of privilege. Naya learned the contours of that danger as plainly as if she had touched a live wire. Servants' glances sharpened, thresholds shifted, invitations became omissions. Unsaid accusations gathered like storm clouds in the town and the mansion both. Yet alongside those clouds there was a strange warmth, small, stubborn, insurgent, in Lucien's presence. He began to learn how to laugh not as a practiced sound, but as something that rose up because it was wanted. He began to ask questions that had nothing to do with stately duties and everything to do with wonder. What does it feel like to stand in the market at noon? Do people always judge each other by what they carry? He listened to answers the way someone who had been given a map would treasure its lines. Sometimes he would close his eyes and breathe Naya's scent, rain and bread, and something else he could not name. And the lines that had marked his life as a thing of pedigree softened for him in private. And in the half-light of the west wing, where candles refused to gossip and the walls kept only what they were told, the two of them learned the slow lexicon of each other's being. How her fingers fit into his palm, the way his laughter surprised itself, the small domesticities that make a life stitched together. The danger did not lessen. If anything, it matured into something more precise. The town sharpened its stories, and the mansion sharpened its rules. But between those two blades, in the thin air reserved for truth, something breathed. Shadows learned to breathe when shown how to by a hand that knew the exact pressure to apply. There was a moment, in the small hours when the mansion's larger sorrows paused and left only the living to keep watch, that Naya realized the illness they named for Lucien had nothing to do with marrow or blood. She had been kneeling by his bed with a rag of warm water, brushing at a fleck of dried tea that clung to his lip, and a servant's whispered conversation drifted through the doorway like a moth caught between panes. "The priests call it a failing of the soul," the servant heard himself say. "But the scholars prefer to hide behind diagrams. It's a blindness, they say, a refusal to be tethered to mortality." Naya did not flinch at the word mortality. She had carried lives that began and ended in the span of market seasons and seen grief cut as clean as a blade. She asked, simply, "How does a soul refuse?" And the man, unused to being asked to place his words so plainly, shrugged as if the question itself made the world heavier. Later, in the west wing with the curtains stitched to keep drafts out and the candlelight thinning like an apology, the head scholar spoke to her with the polite cruelty of the learned. "We have run all measures," he said. "Ties to blood, rights from older books, a dozen drafts. The body is not failing in the way you understand. The hollow heart, it is not a wound we can stitch. It is absence shaped like a cavity. It is a refusal." Naya's fingers smoothed the blanket the way she had smoothed linens at dawn in other homes, and when she spoke it was as if she were speaking to a stubborn child. "People stop living for many reasons," she said. "Sometimes because there is no one at the other side of the morning to say their name." Her voice had the blunt honesty of someone who had learned that small truths are sometimes necessary medicine. The scholar made an unreadable face. The mansion had many remedies, but few for what listened. Lucien, who had been barely aware like a figure carved and left on a shelf, stirred when she said the thing that felt most like a name. His hand, thin as a peeled reed, twitched against the sheets. "Is it better," he murmured, "to breathe with the knowledge of an ending or to live forever without it?" That question hung between them with an ache that did not fit into charts. Naya looked down at his hands and then at his face that the scholars had so carefully catalogued, and it dawned on her like a slow sunrise. The boy did not want immortality's steady, endless weather. He wanted the jaggedness of mortal life, the sharpness of love and loss, and his soul, for reasons that had nothing to do with biology, was refusing the numbness of endlessness. "Maybe you are tired of being preserved," she said. "Maybe you think being kept means you cannot be yourself." He laughed then, a small sound that surprised even him. It was not the laugh of someone with a role learned and rehearsed, but the laugh of someone who remembered forgetting how to be simple. "I envied people once," he said, voice composed of fossil and fresh rain. "I envied the ones who could promise endings and mean them. I used to listen to windows across the river, to children arguing over who got the last orange, and I thought, what is it to need someone so much the heart aches? We were taught to look upon such needs as weakness, but from where I stood, it looked like life." Naya pressed the warm cloth to his forehead, her palm a plain, ordinary pressure. "There is a difference between wanting death and wanting to be known," she said. "You've been kept to be an emblem. You haven't been given the chance to be chosen for yourself." The truth of that settled, inside Lucien, with the soft, inevitable weight of a truth finally named. He had lived in rooms that echoed with his father's will and council's edicts. He had been displayed like a specimen of perfection. To love someone, fully and recklessly, in a way that leaves you vulnerable to being broken, was an idea both frightening and luminous. In the hush of the West Wing, the two of them began to speak in ways not common in halls that taught restraint. About cold nights in the market, about the taste of overripe figs, about a child's stubborn joy at stealing a citrus peel and dancing in the rain. Their closeness was small at first. Naya taught Lucien how to feel the heat of bread and how to fold a linen corner into a neat square. She stole him a piece of plain, toasted bread one afternoon and watched, fascinated, as he discovered the delight of a small, real hunger answered. He taught her, in turn, to name constellations she had only ever seen as a blur on long walks. He showed her the way certain lullabies changed when sung in the original tongue. She laughed at the strange vowels as if they were jokes only she understood. Those shared intimacies had the slow power of a tide. Lucien's glow, the faint, bioluminescent thread that had first surfaced where Naya's hand rested, steadied. The scholars, whose instruments tracked things in tick marks and decimals, recorded stabilization. They could not, however, measure the warmth that had chased the pallor from his cheeks. The candle light in the room seemed less like a reprimand and more like an honest companion. One night, when the moon cut its own precise coin of light through the shutters, and the house kept only the soft symphony of distant footsteps, Lucien turned to Naya with a vulnerability she had only ever seen in children leaning on their mothers. "If I die," he said, the words brittle with fear, "will you remember me? Will people say I was the prince who could not live if a low-born girl touched him?" Naya's fingers closed on his, blunt and sure. She could feel the faint thread of warmth pulse against the thin skin of his palm. "I will remember you," she said. "Not as a prince, but as a person who liked toasted bread and hated the way carpets made noises. And I will tell the market about you, but I will tell them the truth." That was not an answer that protected him from the court or the lineage. It only promised recognition beyond the halls that sought to conserve him. Love between them was not the fevered consummation of a fairy tale. It was an accumulation of small, brave acts. Bringing warm broth when the night was sharp, staying long enough for him to confess a small, private shame, laughing at a joke that had no audience. Theirs was a love that grew in the soft hours and in the unremarkable steadiness of returned presence. It was, in short, the kind of love that can, if allowed, heal the places left hollow. But the house had ears that were practiced in caution, and the kingdom had guardians of purity who watched for any rustle that might threaten lineage. Their murmurings thickened into something clinical and cold. "The girl is an anomaly. She cannot be permitted to awaken the blood. She will draw contagion to the throne." Old men in council chambers dusted off genealogies like spellbooks and traced family trees with a finger that trembled with both fear and the hunger for control. The phrase that cut through the mansion like a blade, said in the precise, grave voices of men who had made duty their religion, was as simple as it was lethal. "If the girl lives," the elder declared, hands folded over a map that had not been drawn for such an eventuality, "our bloodline ends." It was not a prophecy so much as a verdict dressed in certainty. The phrase followed Naya like a shadow. When she walked through the market and the bakery woman watched her hands fold dough, there was suddenly a new smallness in the way people measured her. At the same time, a quiet faction began to form within the house. Servants who saw the gentle change, one or two younger nobles whose eyes did not hide their curiosity, a priest who, in a moment of private confession, admitted that he had always envied those who could let themselves love openly. Naya felt the weight of being both cure and threat. It worked its way into her sleep as an image of two hands. One open and inviting, the other closed into a fist meant to protect ancestry at any cost. She was young, and she had been taught to take what work came, to do what kindness she could where she could. But kindness, she realized, was now a political act. The warmth she offered a fading child was being read as an affront to law. In the quiet just before dawn, Lucien took her face between his fingers with the careful touch of someone studying a new bloom. "If they hate you for me," he said, "I will stand beside you until they understand." Naya, who understood what it was to be both invisible and impossible, let the softness between them be a kind of instruction. "Then teach them," she said. "Teach them that a heart is not less because it is human. Teach them that to live rightly, you do not need to be carved from the right blood. Teach them to be small enough to be honest." It was a tender, dangerous pact. She would anchor him with her attention. He would refuse the ease of immortality when the time came. They made promises in whispered syllables, not the kind that the council would note in their ledgers, but the small, stubborn vows that stitched two ordinary people into the work of being seen. Outside the mansion, the town prepared its chorus. Inside the mansion, elders sharpened their knives of doctrine. Between those two forces, the fragile architecture of their love began to either solidify into something formidable or crack under the pressure of history. Naya could not tell which. All she knew was that when she pressed her palm to Lucien's chest, she felt, faint but insistently, a heartbeat that wanted to be more. The king's decree arrived at noon, folded in black-edged vellum and carried by men whose boots sounded like sentences on cobble. When the herald read the words in the market square, people stopped mid-bargain to listen. For when a monarch spoke, gossip gathered itself into law for the space of a breath. By order of his sovereign, Naya of Sparrow Runs, is to be held for trial under charge of witchcraft and treason. The king's council will assemble in the Hall of Thorns this eve. Someone in the crowd hissed. Children who had once chased Naya's cart folded their small faces into curious masks. She, who had been moving steady as a reed through the days, had not been given time to think. The men with the boots arrived at her door before she could. They were precise when they moved, practiced in the grammar of removing someone from their life. A neighbor tried to push a coin into Naya's hand. She slipped it back and smiled a little too kindly. "I must go," she said. They did not take her by force at first. There was a protocol to everything in Marrowbridge, a pretense of consent, the space for one last breath of innocence. The king's men presented her with the vellum and read aloud in the way men recite prayers, as if the sound would make the verdict holy. Naya listened with the calm of someone who had long been taught to make work of small things, who had learned that the world insists on certain cruelties, and that stoicism is a practical skill. "You have no idea what they will do," whispered a friend from Sparrow Runs, eyes rimmed with fear. "They say," he did not finish. No one could make the exactness of the council's malice sound less than inevitable. At dusk the Hall of Thorns awaited. A room of high ceilings where portraits of ancestors looked down with the same composed disdain they always had. The council sat in carved chairs, their robes like the bark of ancient trees. Priests, scholars, nobles, the very men who had called Naya an anomaly, were now the judges of her fate. Torches changed the air into something older, and the throne shadowed the room like an accusation. They bound her hands in a rope that was ceremonial more than practical. It sealed the performance. The head scholar read the charges with the careful diction of a man who believed in the power of his own reasoning. "You, Naya of Sparrow Runs," he intoned, "did with deliberate intent bewitch the king's son, Lucien, via unlawful arts. You used touch, charm, and sorcery to awaken him, thus corrupting the sanctity of our bloodline and threatening the stability of the realm." A murmur traveled through the hall like a shiver. Naya's stomach clenched, but what she felt then was not fear of death. It was an odd, deep disappointment at the ugliness of words shaped for hurting. "I touched a fevered hand," she said when the space allowed it, her voice small but steady. "I brought tea. I told him stories so his breath might come easier." A counselor, old enough that his teeth were more memory than enamel, scoffed. "Stories knit the minds of fools," he said. "You speak of kindness as though it is a trade. It is an infecting thing." Others laughed, the sound like dry leaves. The word witchcraft had a taste like iron in the air. The gathered men turned that taste into a verdict before anyone had sworn. They summoned witnesses who would say the things the council needed to hear. A maid who claimed to have seen Naya at the stairs with Lucien's hair in her hands. A gardener who insisted the ground around the west wing had warmed since her visits. The language was thin and efficient. It wrapped itself as tight as a bandage around a predecided end. In the corner, Lucien's father sat like a statue who had learned to be unmoved, and the king watched with a gravity that made the candles seem less bright. Then, as if the hall itself were a stage waiting for a spontaneous truth, Lucien stood. He had come not in the edict of a prince, but with the human vulnerability of someone thrice betrayed by his lineage and twice by his body. He moved slowly. The scholars watched with the keen interest of surgeons who had never believed in miracles. When Lucien's voice reached them, it was not polished for rhetoric. It trembled. "You will not pronounce a sentence on things you do not understand," he said. "She is not a witch. She is the one who gave me back my name." There was a short, breathless silence, an animal pause of the world listening. He crossed the room without the flourish of nobility and stood before the council, before his father, and he spoke to them all the simplest of words, the ones that make certain things untrue for only a moment. "I love her." It was a claim and a confession. It was a rebellion folded into a plea. The council's expressions hardened like iron set. The king's jaw worked. An elder at the back hissed like a cut rope. Men who had practiced judgment, all their lives found themselves surprised by the way the word love one of them spoke carried the room like a tide. "You are a prince," one of them said sharply. "You cannot make such declarations and expect not to have consequences." "Love has consequences," Lucien answered. His eyes found Naya's across the room and softened in a way the portraits could not have taught him. He reached out, and when his hand touched hers in the place where ropes bound them, the hall inhaled. No one could have prepared for what came next. Lucien's breath, which had been a shallow tide for weeks, stumbled. His knees buckled. A faint gasp tore out of him like a small animal. The hollowness the scholars had named with their Latin and diagrams reached its peak. A strain, as if a thread were being pulled through a too tight needle. The physicians surged, hands and instruments and perfumed hands that reached but could not find purchase. His eyes fluttered. For a heartbeat, there was the image of a child who had been taught to stand very straight. Then the light in his gaze dimmed. Naya's world narrowed to the line of his ribs. She could hear the medicine men pat the air as they worked, the sound of papers being turned into talismans. The council chanted like a chorus of rationality, trying to drown the human noise with procedure. The king, whose whole life had been the preservation of a line, clenched his fist until the veins sang. They seized Naya then. The men who had performed such rituals all their life found a new instrument: force. She was wrestled down, the rope cutting into her wrists. Someone struck her. The blow was intended to remind her of her place. Pain is a precise language, but pain could not keep her silence. She saw Lucien fall as if plunged into winter, and something very private and old rose up in her. "Stop!" she shouted, but like many pleas inside courts of law, it was measured and ignored. "Please!" Her voice broke. The room tightened its circle. When she could not reach him with her words, she reached with her hands. She had not planned to be a martyr. She had not planned to make herself an offering. But blood is simple, honest, the old medicine of the market she had learned from a midwife's shorthand. A cut can bring warmth, a touch can make a body answer. Naya did the only thing that felt like truth. With fingers that were shaking for the first time in her life, she forced her hand beneath the rope, found the place between his ribs where she had once laid her whole palm in tenderness, and touched him there, palm to skin. Pain lanced bright along the edge of her wrist. A guard or a glove had nicked her. The blood came sudden as a confession, dark and hot. It trembled across her skin in a small, precise bead, and then, by an impulse older than fear, she pressed the wound against Lucien's chest. The contact was not ritual. It was not a recited spell. It was a pure human thing, a giving of what she had, raw and unornamented. The hall, filled with the pomp of 1,000 years of hierarchy, watched like people witnessing a small domestic miracle, and then trying to translate it into their own languages of power. At first nothing seemed to happen. Then light answered, as if someone inside Lucien lit a lantern he had kept closed for lifetimes. The blood she had given him did not mingle as doctors expect. It did something else entirely. It brightened. It leapt like a captured sun, a thread of crimson that shone as if lit from within, and traveled from the place where her palm met his chest up through veins that the scholars had mapped as if they were lakes. A sound like a bell, pure and raw, rang clear and ragged in the hall. Gasps flooded the chamber. The scholars took a step back as if science had been insulted by spectacle. The priests fell to their knees and crossed themselves as if the sight might be both heresy and miracle at once. Lucien's eyes, which had been clouded by an absence, opened wide and focused. Color rushed into his cheeks, as if the world had been repainted with the simplest of hues. The hollow the doctors had talked about folded in on itself and filled with some warmth that smelled of markets and rain. The effect was immediate and impossible. Lucien inhaled in a breath that was not shallow. He coughed, and when he spoke it was with a voice that held the small tremor of one who had been given a second chance. "Naya!" The court did not know how to be anything but stunned. For a few seconds, the Hall of Thorns no longer resembled a seat of power, but a witness to an act of mercy. People who had plotted lineage found themselves bereft of their old words. The phrase, witchcraft, hung damp and thin in the air like old cloth. The king's face was a mask in which shame and fury fought. He saw the proof, his son alive, breathing color back into a face the council had deemed hollow. and the proof cut like a blade. To admit that a low-born human had mendied his child was to admit that his doctrines were brittle. He could not allow that admission to stand. With a voice that had, until now, been a law, he pronounced the punishment he believed would restore order. "She must die," he said. The decree fell with the same weight as the sewn vellum. "For the safety of the house." The cry of the executioners gathered. Chains, cold and decisive, were fetched. Men moved to seize Naya, dragged her toward the door where the town's judgment is carried out. Mothers in the gallery wept. Some of those same mothers had once tutted about Naya's skin. The weight of contradiction is a heavy thing to carry. Lucien saw the motion, saw the rope that would consign the hand that had saved him to nothingness, and something behind his pupils flashed. It started as a heat at the base of his skull and spread like ink dissolving in water. Air around him thickened as if drawn through a screen. His bones did not look like bone for a moment. They looked like the architecture of a thing that had been built to last, and then discovered it was built from a different material entirely. He stood then in a manner that held not the fragile prince they had made of him, but a guardian shape older than the hall itself. Shadows moved at the edge of his shoulders, and then swelled like wings. They were not feathered, but rather a billow of black that drank light. Smoke pooled and shaped into the arc of a wing, then another, both spread wide with a sound like thunder in a room made of glass. The council flinched. The king reached for his staff as if it would be enough to command a son who had become myth. Lucien's eyes were no longer the pale glass of sickness. They were embers, bright, molten, alive with the kind of heat that remakes metal. He moved between the men who would take Naya and the doorway, the shadowings folding in a way that made the torches gutter. "No one touches her," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried like a bell. The smoke at his shoulders curled protectively, the air pressing like a shield. The assembly, men who had long believed their vows unassailable, found themselves stilled. The king, furious and wounded pride flaring into something near hatred, lifted a hand. "You have betrayed your line," he whispered. "You would stand with her and bring down all we have built." Lucien's answer was a look that tore the room open. "I would rather lose a throne than lose my heart." The wings tightened their circle. Embers shone like stars newly born. For a moment the Hall of Thorns saw a different kind of rule, one born of choice instead of heirship. And then the silence broke with the sound of 100 small gasps and a single, terrible question that the council would carry like a scar. The man who had spent his life carving the rules of blood and worth found that his child had chosen differently, had become, in the space between a heartbeat and a breath, a force that would not allow cruelty in the name of lineage. Outside the hall, the townspeople listened, and they did not know what to say. Inside, a girl with rope marks on her wrists lay against a living man who had been called a prince and had become something else entirely. Between them, the echo of the bell of Lucien's revival still sang, a reminder that sometimes the truest power is love given without calculation, and that such love can change the shape of rules that were never meant to include it. The morning after the Hall of Thorns still smelled of smoke and wax. Men who had been certain of the world's rules walked with a new, unsure gait. The carved chairs in the council room seemed to remember a hand that had gripped them and now found that grip gone. The king, who had ruled in a geometry of law and lineage for decades, did not rise at dawn as he always had. He complained of a cold that no cloak could warm, of a tightness behind his ribs as if some ancient suturing had begun to fail. It was not merely a fever. Those who watched him closest, physicians who had once measured his son's pulse and missed the heart beneath the hollow, saw changes that had no easy name. His skin lost a sheen that had been part of the image of rule. Where his veins once lay like ribbons, there were blotches like ink spills. His voice, usually a careful instrument of command, frayed at the edges, the timbre rougher as if night itself sat heavy in his throat. The king, who had always spoken of the inevitability of their line, now made a sound that was more private than pronouncement. A small, involuntary exhale that sounded like wonder and like fear mixed. Word moved through Marrowbridge the way the river moved the town's secrets. Under bridges, through shutters, in the hush between a pot's whistle and a child's footfall. "The king is ill," someone said, and the market's knives paused mid-slice. "After what the girl did," someone else added in a lowered voice, like a coin placed carefully on a scale. It was, in a strange way, a miracle recast into the town's language, not because people were certain of what had happened, but because certainty had ruptured and something tender had slipped through. The Council of Thorns, fearing the admission that their doctrines could be wrong, convened with a quickness that smelled of precaution. They filled the palace with quiet strategies, to shore the king, to reorder ritual to secure the line. Lucien watched from the windows of the West Wing, wrapped in blankets and haunted by the image of Naya's hand pressed to his chest. The council's maneuverings felt to him like a theater of protocol, where he had once performed the role written for him. Now his heart, newly beating and painful with its human weight, asked questions the scripts did not include. He made a choice that looked, to the world, like an abdication, but for him felt like an unshackling. Lucien did not seize the throne that the king offered by default. Instead, he stepped away. In a small chamber that smelled faintly of lavender and old books, he signed papers that left administration of the realm to the council and to his father's guardianship. The wording was careful. The meaning was simple. He would not let the machinery of lineage suffocate the things he had learned to value. In the clear, unadorned space of his own agency, he turned his back on the throne that had once been his cage. "You will anger them," his father warned in a rasp where memory and ambition tangled. But the king's voice had the brittle sound of a man realizing that strength is sometimes arithmetic and sometimes something else entirely. Lucien listened, and for once felt no need to parry with duty. Leaving the mansion was a small rebellion that felt enormous to him. He walked without guards, wrapped in a plain cloak Naya might have approved of. The town did not know he would come. He hoped only to find her, not as prince or spectacle, but as the person who had given him a heartbeat. The river knew where she lived. It had carried her soft acts like a drift of paper and remembered their edges. Naya's exile was a gentle thing in practice and hard-edged in consequence. She had not been publicly sentenced to a gallows. The town's punishments were subtler, the kind that could starve a person of the small civilities that make city life possible. Sparrow Runs found itself emptied of certain customers. Invitations that once existed to places of warmth no longer came. She had taken to walking at dawn and resting by the river bank, where the market's noise was muffled and the river made a language of its own. There, leaned against a knotty root, she bared her wrists to the sun and let the water tell stories she did not have the energy to narrate. He found her there, as if the river had guided him by a compass only water could keep. She sat on a flat stone, skirt tucked modestly, hands busy mending a small tear in a linen sack. Her hair was pinned back, and the morning made a soft crown of light at the edge of her scarf. When she looked up and saw him, the world held the small surprise of a breath that hadn't expected to end. "Naya," Lucien said, not the pronouncement meant for courts, not the name a herald would announce, but the small, private address of someone who has come home. Her first movement was caution, surprise wrapped in the habit of someone who had been taught to expect cruelty. "You shouldn't be here," she said, but her voice betrayed the way her body remembered the warmth of him like a ledger of small mercies. She had not allowed herself the indulgence of hope. It felt too expensive. "I left," he said simply, and the river caught his words like a child catching pebbles. "I could not hold a throne that would ask me to condemn you." Her eyes widened, but not entirely with disbelief. She had seen the ache in him, the way life had sharpened and not dulled him. "You'll be hunted," she said. "You'll be blamed." "Let them blame me," he answered. There was a steadiness to him now that was not performance. The human pulse that had scared the scholars into charts had given him something else, a clarity that made his hands less tentative. "They can have what they want, the crown, the ceremonies. I want to learn to sit in the market and be ordinary." Naya laughed then, a small, incredulous sound that stitched a warmth across her face. "I have no room for kings in my pantry," she teased, but her fingers did not stop their mending. There was old, practical humor between them, the kind that makes the world less dangerous for a moment. He sat beside her on the flat stone, his knees not quite brushing hers by accident, but by the manners he had been taught to maintain. The river ran its precise, indifferent song. Around them, the town woke and shuffled in a rhythm that had already begun to question its own lessons. Mothers passed with baskets and kept one eye on them. A child tugged at a father's sleeve and pointed, whispering. A vendor who had once refused to share a bench crossed the square now and left a small loaf by Naya's door later that morning. An anonymous olive branch. Lucien reached for her hand. The gesture was not theatrical but ordinary, and that ordinariness made it holy to him. He lowered himself onto one knee in the damp grass, a move that carried the gravity of ceremony and the humility of a man who had learned his priorities. The river hissed encouragement. The sky was the color of unlit pewter. "You gave me a heartbeat," he said, voice barely above the water's hush, the words fragile as a newly formed bridge. "Let me spend it on you." The line was less a proposal in the courtly sense than an offering. Time, recognition, the choice to walk beside her in a world that still tried to name them both as errors. Naya felt the damp of the grass under her skirt and the quickness in her chest that every human knows, the sound of courage and fear braided into one. For a long instant she could only look at him, seeing not the prince and not the myth but the man who had learned to want. She thought of the rope's bite on her wrists, of the hall of thorns, of the market's whispers, and of the way his eyes looked now, unguarded and grateful. She let herself open to the offer the way a tired person opens a window to let a breeze in. "Spend it," she said at last, and it was more of a command than a plea. "Spend it being honest. Spend it being present. Spend it eating badly in market corners and learning the names of herbs." He smiled then, a small, boyish thing that seemed to surprise them both. He rose and, without ceremony, kissed the top of her hand as if sealing a pact. Around them, the town's day stitched on. Some watched, some looked away, some, with older prejudices that never entirely die, tightened their lips. But other things had already begun to move. A woman from the bakery who had tutted at Naya's skin the week before left an extra bun that morning at her door. A child who had once thrown a slate at her cart helped to steady a basket when it slipped. Little, private gestures that would become the stitches of a new fabric. They walked back into the town together, not as prince and delivery girl, but as two people who had chosen one another against a tide of expectation. The river followed, attentive, carrying their smallness and their courage downstream. In the Hall of Thorns, the king had sunk into a sleep that was less the end than a long, uncertain pause. Rumor softened into gratitude. And Marrowbridge, always a town fond of tidy hierarchies, discovered, in handfuls and in whispers, that miracles do not always come wrapped in legend. Sometimes they arrive damp from the river, smelling faintly of rosemary and bread. Marrowbridge did not change all at once. No town ever does. It changed in the way a river changes a stone, patient, persistent, with small edges worn down until something new is visible. The first stroke of that change was a door with a painted sign, a heart rendered in honest, clumsy strokes, and beneath it the words Naya's care, the heart of Marrowbridge. The paint was the color of pomegranate seed. It had been mixed by hand in jars the midwife kept for ink. To some it looked like a child's painting. To those who needed help, it looked like a promise. The clinic was in the low building where Sparrow Runs used to keep its crates. Low-ceilinged, warm from a single hearth, shelves lined with glass bottles and cloth bundles. Naya had chosen the place for reasons a planner would not understand. It faced the river, and a lemon tree grew in the yard whose blossoms smelled like courage in bloom. She kept a kettle always on the boil. There was a bench for waiting, carved out of an old cart, and a curtain hand-stitched from spare linen to give privacy to the half-dozen cots inside. A brass bell called people in, the same bell that had once rung for deliveries now called those who needed remedy. She did not set rules about who could come. That was the point. The heart of Marrowbridge was not a charity that kept tabs. It was a place that assumed worth. Women with swollen bellies and men with coughs, an elderly scholar whose hands no longer wrote steady letters, chimney-swept children with scabbed knees. They lined up in days that smelled of citrus and bread. And then, one evening, as dusk that used to be reserved for nobles bled into the market, Lucien appeared with his cloak rolled into a parcel and flour dusting his palms from a loaves he had kneaded. The sight of him among the common benches was small heresy and large comfort. He did not come in crowns. He came in patience. He learned quickly how to boil herbs to loosen a stubborn cough, how to hold a candle so it would not smoke into a baby's face, how to write the names of potions legibly for those who could not read them themselves. People watched the prince-turned apprentice in amazement at first, and then with the ordinary acceptance that comes when kindness is practiced each day. Lucien's hands smelled now of rosemary and yeast and ink, and they trembled less when Naya rested her fingers on his wrist. The House of Thorns did not vanish. Institutions do not disappear because one pupil refuses to play their part. But the council's voice did not ring as absolute in the streets anymore. Some elders withdrew into their books and muttered about precedent. Others, younger, hungrier for the world's surprises, came to the clinic on quiet mornings and left with pockets of tea and a different kind of knowledge. A few of the servants who had once watched Naya with coin-cold eyes now used their silver spoons to stir broth on the clinic stove. Change always had collaborators. Word of the miracle, of the prince whose hollow had been filled by a delivery girl's hand, became a story that bent and softened as people retold it. Mothers taught it to children not as a cautionary tale, but as an odd, hopeful instruction. Do not be so certain your rules are law. The market that had once judged skin and coin learned to measure people by different things. Whether they folded their neighbor's coat when it rained, whether they came back with soup for the sick, whether they kept their promises. Lanterns, small, old-glass bulbs began to appear along the river on each full moon, tied to the railings in bright, careful knots. They were not an edict. They were an offering, light for the dark and for many, a memorial for the change Naya had asked of them simply by being herself. There were awkward days. Some men spat where they once greeted. Some mothers spoke in low, tutting voices. Old prejudices died like bruises, slowly, and sometimes with scabs. But there were more days of unexpected charity. A baker who had refused credit to Naya's mother last winter left a loaf at the clinic each dawn. A child who had thrown stones at her cart now arrived with flowers plucked clumsily from a neighbor's yard, and held them out with the look of an apology learned too late. These gestures, humble and frequent, were the mortar between remodeling stones. Lucien stood by her not because he wanted to step into a public role again, but because he understood what it meant to be held by someone who loved without ledger. He sat at a small table by the window and wrote prescriptions in a hand that grew steadier each day. Patients found him less startling now. He was part of the furniture of the place, a quiet presence who handed a warm rag with hands that knew the weight of work. When someone asked how a prince could knead dough, he answered with a grin. Because it is good for the hands, because it makes bread that tastes like childhood. Their partnership became ordinary and therefore powerful. They shared a bed in the little room above the clinic. Not a throne room, not a nest of opulence, but a small, honest chamber with a patchwork quilt sewn by neighbors and a window that watched the river. Lucien would wake most nights to the sound of the kettle, or to Naya counting herbs in the dark. And he would hold her hand and remember the years when he had been a figure painted for distance. She, who had long been practiced in concealment, taught him how to be seen in smaller, truer ways. Their love was not a spectacle of fireworks, but a steady lamp that kept its flame in rain. People came from further afield, drawn by rumor and by the insistence of hope. A vampiric woman with silver hair and an old sorrow crossed the threshold one morning, cloak heavy with the perfume of far hills. She was received without question and treated for grief that had nothing to do with blood. A father with a child in fever found the same hands that had once folded bread now pressing cool cloth to a brow. The clinic's rule of open doors became an unspoken revolution. All who needed refuge could come. One afternoon, an emissary from the Hall of Thorns visited with a stiff bow. He did not come to gloat. He had come to bring a petition. The council sought a remedy for a wasting that had begun to touch more than the king. They had names of scholars and ledgers. They had been taught that their rules preserved them. They were now learning that rules could be brittle. The emissary watched as a woman, a midwife who once tutted at Naya's color, accepted a cup of tea, and later, the woman's hands trembled less as she learned the steam heel method for small burns. The emissary left with a small journal tied with twine and with notes that smelled of surprise. On the nights when the lanterns floated along the river, The town came down in small clusters. They lit their lamps and whispered not just about what had happened, but about what might happen next. Naya stood by the railing sometimes, Lucien at her side, and listened to Markets breathing out confessions. There was a child who would not meet her eyes at first, but who, one moonlit night, pressed a hand into hers and said simply, "Thank you." That hand was the town's future in palm-size wrapped confession. When Naya spoke in public, which she rarely did except for the market squares when a crisis demanded plain advice, she used her voice the way she had always used it. Spare, honest, and strong enough to anchor others. She told people the truth in small sentences that fit in the mouth. They said I was too dark to be seen, too poor to be heard. She would pause, letting the simple cadence settle into faces. There were always those who would scoff. There were always those who had never known hunger and could not imagine it. But there were also those who had lived in the shadows and could now see, by the lamplight and river, the possibility of other reckonings. But love doesn't ask what you are made of. It only asks if you can see someone's soul, even when the world looks away. Her words became a kind of compass in small hands. They were not law, they were invitation. Years later, when the king's voice had dwindled into private rooms, and Lucien's name was spoken more often as a man who had renounced a throne than as a prince who had tarnished a line, people would remember the simple things. The bread left at a latch, the kettle that never stopped singing, the lanterns that claimed the river each full moon. They would remember a girl who learned how to make medicine from bones of practical knowledge, and a man who chose to stand at her side. On one such moon, when the river carried lantern light like a caravan of stars, Naya stood by the railing. Lucien tightened his grip on her hand and said nothing, for nothing needed to be said. The town hummed its tentative peace below them, and the night, which had once been a place of hiding and of rules that judged by color and coin, leaned forward as if to learn. Naya closed her eyes and thought of all the small things that had brought them here. Bread, a warm rag, a hand that refused to leave another's ribs untended. And in a voice that had learned its own power, she spoke for herself and for many who had been taught to be small. They said I was too dark to be seen, too poor to be heard. But love doesn't ask what you are made of. It only asks if you can see someone's soul, even when the world looks away. Lucien pressed his forehead to hers, and the lanterns shivered like a congregation blessing them. The river carried the light away. And in that moment, even the night learned how to love the light.